woman I married as part of a cruel multi-million-dollar bet turned out to be the only person who could destroy my entire empire. I thought she was my pawn, but I had no idea I was the one walking into her game. Tell me, what would you do if the person you set out to break ended up being the only one who could put you back together? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. My name is Ethan Vance, and if you have a moment, I'd like to tell you the story of how I lost a bet and won my life. The air at the top of the Salesforce Tower was thin and tasted of money. From 61 floors up, San Francisco sprawled below like a circuit board of glittering lights, a complex system that Ethan Vance believed with every fiber of his being he had mastered. The gala was a monument to his latest victory, the successful launch of a satellite network that now blanketed half the globe. But for Ethan, victory was a fleeting data point, immediately replaced by the cold calculus of the next acquisition. He stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, a figure carved from steel and ambition, his custom-tailored Tom Ford suit a dark armor against the glittering artifice of the room. A junior executive was babbling at his side, something about market synergy. Ethan wasn't listening. He raised his phone, his thumb gliding over the cool glass. Finalize the acquisition, he murmured, his voice a low thrum that cut through the ambient chatter, and liquidate their R&D department. Effective immediately. The executive's face paled. But sir, their team is now a liability. Ethan finished pocketing his phone without a flicker of emotion. He turned his piercing gray eyes on the man. Your services at this event are no longer required. He dismissed the man with a subtle nod, his gaze already sweeping the room, calculating, assessing. That's when he saw him. Caleb Reed. Caleb was leaning against a marble column, a flute of champagne held loosely in his hand, a predatory smirk playing on his lips. If Ethan was a precision-engineered weapon, Caleb was a panther, all fluid grace and concealed danger. Their rivalry was the stuff of Silicon Valley legend, a bitter war waged in boardrooms and stock markets. Another city at your feet, Vance, Caleb said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey as he approached. You must get bored of winning in such sterile environments. Ethan arched a single perfect eyebrow. Success is never boring, Reed. It's a concept you might want to get acquainted with. Caleb laughed, a low, dismissive sound. Oh, I'm acquainted with it. But your victories are always the same. You buy things. You crush things. It's all code and contracts. You thrive on aesthetic perfection. Perfect code, perfect companies. Perfect women who look like they were assembled in a lab. His eyes scanned the room, a glint of malicious intent in them. But I bet you couldn't win something real, something unpolished. His gaze landed on the dessert bar. There a woman was meticulously arranging a tray of miniature lemon tarts. She moved with a quiet, focused grace, her hands dusted with a faint trace of flour, working with an artist's precision. She wasn't the typical rail-thin model type that populated these events. She was a plus-size woman, her curves unapologetic under a simple professional black chef's coat. There was a warmth about her, an earthy authenticity that seemed to absorb the cold light of the room and radiate it back as something genuine. Her, Caleb said the word, a soft, sharp dart. He pointed with his champagne flute. The baker. Ethan followed his gaze, a flicker of contempt in his eyes. He saw a simple, unassuming woman, an easy variable. What about her? Ethan asked, his tone laced with boredom. I bet you a controlling stake in the Ether AI project that you can't win her. Caleb challenged, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that drew the attention of a few nearby tech titans. The air crackled. The Ether project was the Holy Grail, a quantum AI initiative worth tens of billions. Ethan's posture stiffened. Define win. Caleb's smirk widened into a grin. Oh, I'm not talking about a one-night conquest. That's your usual crude playbook. No, this requires finesse. He leaned closer. Marry her. Make me and the entire world believe that you, Ethan Vance, are genuinely madly in love with her. For 1 full year. Public appearances, gushing interviews, the whole performance. You have to be utterly convincing. The challenge hung in the air, audacious and insulting. It was a jab at Ethan's core identity, his obsession with control, with perfection. Caleb was implying he couldn't handle something unpredictable, human. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Ethan's face. The value of the Ether stake was immense, but it was the arrogance of the challenge that sealed it. He looked over at the woman Maya Coleman, her nameplate read. She was now placing a perfect sprig of mint on a chocolate lava cake. He saw her not as a person but as the objective, a simple working-class woman who would undoubtedly be overwhelmed by his wealth, his world. She would be putty in his hands. "You have a deal, Reed," Ethan said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. He extended a hand. "Prepare to transfer your shares." They shook, the silent promise of battle passing between them. An hour later, as the gala began to wind down, Ethan made his move. He approached the dessert bar, turning on the practiced million-dollar charm that had swayed investors and models alike. "These are extraordinary," he said, his voice a warm, intimate purr as he gestured to the array of pastries. "Truly the work of an artist." He expected her to blush, to stammer, to be flustered by the sudden attention from the man whose face was on the cover of every business magazine. Maya Coleman looked up from her work. Her eyes, a warm, intelligent brown, met his directly. There was no awe in them, only a calm professionalism. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice even and pleasant. "I'm glad you enjoyed them." "Ethan, please," he insisted, leaning an elbow on the counter. "I was hoping I could buy the artist a drink to celebrate your success here tonight." She wiped her hands on a clean towel, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. "That's a very kind offer, Ethan. But my success tonight will be celebrated at 5 a.m. tomorrow morning when I have to pull the first batch of sourdough out of the oven. A baker's schedule is unforgiving." She bent down and retrieved a small paper bag from under the counter. She placed it in his hand. It was surprisingly warm. "For the road," she said, "a leftover croissant. They're much better when they're fresh, but I imagine you don't see 5 a.m. very often." And with a polite nod, she turned back to her work, packing away her supplies, her focus absolute. Ethan stood there motionless. The most powerful man in the room, holding a small, grease-stained paper bag. He had been deftly, politely, and utterly dismissed. He looked from the warm pastry in his hand to the woman who had given it to him, and for the first time in a decade, Ethan Vance had absolutely no idea what to do next. The game, he realized with a jolt of ice-cold shock, had already begun, and he may have just miscalculated his opening move. The morning sun sliced through the panoramic windows of Ethan's penthouse, glinting off glass, chrome, and polished concrete. The space was less a home and more a monument to sterile success. Yet on a marble countertop worth more than a luxury car sat a small, unassuming paper bag. It felt like a glitch in the code of his perfect life. Ethan stared at it, the croissant inside now cold. He hadn't eaten it. The act of dismissal it represented was a foreign, irritating variable he couldn't process. He didn't get turned down. He didn't get handed leftovers. The world bent to him. He picked up his phone, his voice sharp and devoid of pleasantries. "Davis," he said to his head of security, "I need a full workup, discreetly. A woman named Maya Coleman, a baker." He paused. "I want to know everything. Her business, her family, her debts, her pressure points. I want it by noon." He ended the call, the problem now delegated, reducible to data points on a screen. He would find her weakness, apply pressure, and the variable would be solved. The bet would be won. It was that simple. Miles away in the heart of the North Shore, the world was anything but simple. It was warm, loud, and smelled overwhelmingly of melting butter and caramelized sugar. The sweet hearth was a sensory embrace, a stark contrast to Ethan's cold fortress. The brick walls were adorned with generations of family photos. The wooden floors were worn smooth by decades of footsteps, and the air hummed with the gentle murmur of community. Maya Coleman moved through the space like it was an extension of her own body, her hands strong and sure, expertly folded dough for the afternoon's brioche. "Heard from the lawyers again this morning," a voice grumbled from behind the espresso machine. Her brother Leo was a mirror of her passion, though his was channeled into a fiery, protective energy. He was wiping down the counter with a ferocity that had little to do with cleaning. "And?" Maya asked, not looking up from her work. "Same garbage, different letterhead," Leo muttered, his jaw tight. "Another lowball offer from Vance Development. They're calling it their final generous community buyout package. Generous. They want to bulldoze Mrs. Petrov's flower shop and call it progress." Maya's hands stilled for a moment. She looked out the large front window. Mrs. Petrov. A tiny woman with a cloud of white hair was watering the flower boxes that hung outside her shop, the one her husband had built for her 50 years ago. She waved, and Maya waved back, a warm, genuine smile gracing her face before it faded. "We'll be at the town hall meeting tonight, Leo," she said, her voice firm, resuming her kneading with renewed purpose. We fight. It's what we do. I know, May. He sighed, his anger softening as he looked at his sister. It's just, this Vance is a different kind of monster. He's buying up politicians, drowning us in legal fees. We're bleeding out and he knows it. Then we'll just have to be smarter, she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. She was the heart of this fight, the anchor that kept the whole neighborhood from being swept away by a tide of corporate greed. At 11:58 a.m., a secure file appeared on Ethan's tablet. He opened it, his eyes scanning the data with cold efficiency. Subject Maya Coleman, co-owner the Sweethearth Bakery, family brother Leo Coleman, parents deceased. Financials, business loan payments are current, but cash flow is tight. Significant legal fees incurred over the last 6 months payable to the North Shore Community Alliance Defense Fund. Then he saw it, the final crucial piece of data. Assets, the Sweethearth, property located at 1582 North Shore Drive. This address was the linchpin. It was the one stubborn, unmovable piece in the center of the 3-block parcel his other company, Vance Development, needed to acquire for its new flagship high-rise. The project was stalled, costing him millions in holding patterns, all because of a handful of legacy businesses. All because of her. A slow, predatory smile touched Ethan's lips. It was perfect. The problem wasn't her. The problem was her bakery, her community, her legacy. He now held the key to all of it. The baker needed to be saved from the monster, and she had no idea that he was the monster. He wouldn't just win the bet. He would solve his development nightmare at the same time. The efficiency of it was beautiful. The little bell above the door of the Sweethearth chimed, announcing a new customer. The cheerful chatter in the bakery died down as every head turned. Ethan Vance stood in the doorway, his impeccably tailored suit, an air of ruthless power seeming to suck all the warmth out of the room. He looked as out of place as a wolf in a sheep pen. His eyes, cold and gray, scanned the room before landing on Maya behind the counter. He walked directly to her, ignoring the line of customers. "Miss Coleman," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that commanded the silence. "I have a business proposition for you, a private one." Leo stepped forward. "Whatever you're selling, we're not interested." Ethan's gaze flickered to Leo for a brief dismissive second before returning to Maya. "This is for your sister to decide." Maya wiped her hands on her apron, her heart starting a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She saw the predatory glint in his eyes. This was not the charming man from the gala. This was someone else entirely. "My office is in the back," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. In the small, cramped office that smelled of vanilla and old paper, he didn't waste a second on pleasantries. He stood, refusing the chair she offered, towering over her desk. "Your bakery, your entire neighborhood, is on the brink of financial collapse," he began, his tone flat, stating a fact. "My development firm has been trying to acquire this land for some time. I'm sure you're aware of the pressure." Maya felt the blood drain from her face. Vance Development. It was him, the man from the gala, the monster trying to destroy her home. They were the same person. A wave of nausea and pure, unadulterated rage washed over her. "I am proposing a solution," he continued, oblivious to her internal chaos. "A 1-year contract, marriage, in name only. A performance for reasons that are my own. In exchange," he named a number, a staggering, life-altering number, a sum that wouldn't just save her bakery, it would allow her to buy the entire block, to franchise, to secure her family's legacy for 100 years. She stared at him, speechless. The audacity, the sheer cold-blooded arrogance of it. To stand there offering to save her from a fire he himself had set. He saw the shock on her face and mistook it for acquiescence. "It's a simple transaction, Miss Coleman," he said. "Everything has a price. I'm offering you yours." The initial shock congealed into something hard and sharp in her chest. A fierce protective fire. He thought he had her. He thought he could buy her home, buy her silence. He thought she was a victim. He was wrong. She slowly stood up, meeting his gaze across the desk. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, strategic clarity she didn't know she possessed. She took a slow breath. "I accept your financial offer, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice dangerously calm. He allowed himself a flicker of a triumphant smile. But she wasn't finished. "But," she paused, letting the word hang in the air between them, "I have one non-negotiable condition." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her defiance. She leaned forward slightly, her brown eyes now as hard as stones. For the duration of our marriage, Advanced Development will declare a complete legally binding moratorium on all acquisition and development activities in the entire North Shore district. Ethan Vance's smile vanished. He stood there for the second time in 24 hours, utterly and completely stunned into silence by the baker he thought he could break. The pawn had just moved across the board and declared itself a queen. The law office was a temple of silent, expensive warfare. The air, chilled to a precise 68 degrees, smelled of leather and paper. On one side of a mahogany table that reflected the city skyline, like a dark mirror, sat Ethan's legal team, 3 men in identical charcoal suits, their faces impassive, their minds like razor-sharp calculators. On the other side sat Maya, and next to her Sarah Jenkins, a woman whose pro bono work for the North Shore community was legendary. Sarah's suit was less expensive, but her eyes were just as sharp, if not sharper. For 2 hours, Ethan's lawyers had tried to poke holes in Maya's one condition. They proposed amendments, suggested carve-outs, and spoke in dense legalese about unforeseen market dynamics. Sarah met every volley with a calm, unshakable defense. "The language is ambiguous here," one of Ethan's lawyers mused, pointing to a clause. "What constitutes development activity?" Sarah leaned forward, her voice clear and precise. "It constitutes anything that requires a city permit, Mr. Hayes. No demolition, no geological surveys, no architectural drafts submitted for approval, and certainly no tenant buyout offers direct or through subsidiary shell corporations." She slid a revised page across the table. "I've clarified it for you." Ethan, who had remained silent at the head of the table, watched the exchange with a detached sort of admiration. His lawyers were paid millions to be sharks, but this woman, she was a shepherd guarding her flock, and she knew exactly where the wolves liked to hide. His phone buzzed with a text from one of his board members. "Are you insane? Halting the North Shore project for a year over this? It's financial suicide." Ethan typed back a single arrogant reply. "It's an investment." His ego wouldn't allow him to back down. He had been challenged and he would win. The cost was irrelevant. Finally, seeing no way out, his lead counsel sighed in defeat. The contract was signed. The moratorium was ironclad. Moving into Ethan's penthouse was like trying to plant a wildflower in a block of ice. The front door opened into a vast expanse of white walls, polished concrete floors, and glass. The only color came from the cold blue of the sky outside. It was breathtakingly beautiful and completely soulless. "My things are downstairs," Maya announced to the empty space. What arrived was not a few suitcases. It was an invasion of warmth and color. A delivery truck brought in an oversized, ridiculously plush armchair in a deep emerald green, which the movers placed at her direction, squarely in the center of the minimalist living room. It looked gloriously, defiantly out of place. Next came boxes of cookbooks, a worn wooden recipe box, and 3 large, vibrant paintings by a local North Shore artist that she immediately hung on his pristine white walls. Ethan came home that evening to a home that was no longer entirely his. The air smelled different. Smelled not of sanitized, filtered nothingness, but of cinnamon and yeast. He followed the scent to the kitchen, a gleaming testament to Italian design that had likely never seen a speck of flour, until now. Maya stood at the marble island, humming softly to a song on the radio as she rolled out a sheet of pastry dough. He stared at the light dusting of flour on his perfect countertops. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice tight. "The kitchen looked lonely," Maya replied cheerfully, not missing a beat with her rolling pin. "I thought I'd introduce it to its purpose. Apple galette. Want some?" He didn't answer, merely retreated to his office, the strange warm scent following him down the hall. A quiet war had been declared on his aesthetic, and he had a sinking feeling he was going to lose. Their first public appearance was a benefit for the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. It was a minefield of Caleb's allies and the city's most powerful figures. "Listen to me," Ethan said in the car on the way over, his tone, that of a general briefing a raw recruit. He handed her a sleek, tiny earpiece. "Put this in. I'll be able to guide you. When I tell you to speak to someone, you speak to them. We need to project unity, devotion. Do you understand?" Maya looked at the tiny piece of technology in her palm. "You want to feed me lines, Ethan. This isn't a spy movie." "This is more important than a spy movie," he countered grimly. "This is perception, and perception is reality." She sighed and put it in. The first hour was excruciating. Ethan's voice was a constant low murmur in her ear. Now smile and laugh at his joke. Ask Marcus Thorne about his Q3 projections. Mention the synergy between our platforms. She felt like a puppet. Then she saw him. Alistair Finch. A legendary old-money philanthropist famous for his massive contributions to the arts. He was standing alone looking at a painting with a melancholic expression. Ethan's voice buzzed in her ear. That's a waste of time, he's old news. I need you to go talk to the CEO of Omnicorp. Maya had had enough. She reached up and discreetly removed the earpiece, dropping it into her clutch. She walked straight to Alistair Finch. It's a beautiful piece, isn't it? She said softly, standing beside him. The artist. She grew up in my neighborhood. Her first studio was in a garage behind the old butcher shop. Alistair turned, his tired eyes lighting up with surprise. For the next 20 minutes, Maya didn't talk about projections or synergy. She spoke with raw, unscripted passion about the importance of community arts programs, about how talent could be found anywhere, if only given a chance, about the soul of a city being in its small galleries and local theaters, not its glass towers. From across the room, Ethan watched in horror, then confusion, then something else. She was captivating. People were drifting over to listen. He saw Alistair Finch, a man who famously never made commitments at public events, pull out a card and press it into her hand. Call my office tomorrow, young lady. Alistair said, his voice booming for all to hear. The Finch Foundation needs to hear more about this, much more. Caleb Reed materialized at Ethan's elbow, a smug look on his face. He'd seen the whole thing. Well, Vance, he drawled, taking a sip of his drink. Didn't take long at all. She's already got you tamed and doing community outreach. He clapped Ethan on the shoulder and walked away laughing. Late that night, the penthouse was silent. The disastrous evening hung between them. Ethan, unable to sleep, walked out into the main living area and was drawn by the light in the kitchen. He found her there. The marble island looked like a snowstorm had hit it. A fine, pervasive layer of flour covered everything. Bags of sugar and chocolate were open, and Maya was kneading a massive ball of dough with a fierce rhythmic intensity. She was stress baking. His first instinct was a surge of raw anger at the sheer, unadulterated mess. But then he saw her face. There was a vulnerability there, a frustrated energy pouring from her hands into the dough. The composed professional woman was gone, replaced by someone real. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, the question that came out wasn't about the mess or the benefit or the bet. It was something else entirely. Why, he asked, his voice softer than he intended. The bakery, your neighborhood, all of it. Why do you fight so hard for it? Maya stopped kneading, her shoulders slumping slightly. She didn't look at him. She looked at her flour-covered hands. Because it's not just a place or a business, she said, her voice quiet and thick with an emotion he couldn't name. My great-grandfather laid the bricks for that bakery after he came here with nothing. My grandmother perfected the sourdough starter we still use today. A starter that is older than both of us. My father, he taught me how to bake in that kitchen. It's our whole story, in one building, on one street. She finally looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You see a piece of real estate, Ethan. I see home. He stared at her, the simple, powerful truth of her words hitting him with an unexpected force. For the first time, he saw a glimpse of the world through her eyes, a world built not on transactions, but on connection, on history, on love. And for a fleeting, terrifying moment, standing in his multi-million-dollar kitchen, Ethan Vance felt a flicker of genuine curiosity. The fragile peace forged in the pre-dawn hours over flour and confessions evaporated under the harsh light of a new business day. Ethan Vance did not do vulnerability well. Curiosity was an inefficient emotion, and he'd spent the morning ruthlessly purging it from his system, replacing it with the cold, familiar hum of corporate warfare. He was in his office at Vance Technologies, a cavern of glass and steel suspended 50 floors above the city, when his chief financial officer walked in his face the color of ash. Sir, the CFO stammered, placing a tablet on Ethan's desk. It's Arya. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Arya was his latest high-profile investment, a fusion restaurant in the financial district backed by a celebrity chef. It was meant to be the crown jewel of his hospitality portfolio. On the tablet was a web page, the header, a stylized fork drawing a line through a cityscape. The Urban Fork. The headline beneath it was brutal. Aria, a symphony of style with a soulless sound. Ethan scanned the review. It was a masterpiece of eloquent destruction. The writer, the mysterious and anonymous critic known only as the Urban Fork, praised the restaurant's decor as a stunningly expensive place to be disappointed and described the food as having all the passion of a corporate merger. The words were witty, insightful, and utterly devastating. The Urban Fork wasn't just a critic, they were a cultural force. A single post could fill every table for a month, or in this case, trigger a tidal wave of cancellations. Reservations are down 90% since it was posted last night, the CFO said, his voice trembling. The investors are calling, they're threatening to pull out. We're financially crippled. Ethan's jaw clenched. He had been attacked on his own turf. This fork, he said, his voice dangerously low. They've been a nuisance for months. Now they're a liability. He looked at his security chief, Davis, who stood silently by the door. I want to know who they are. Use whatever resources you need. Unmask them. I want to name Davis, and I want it yesterday. Meanwhile, in a sun-drenched corner of Ethan's penthouse, Maya Coleman had carved out her own territory. Her plush emerald armchair had become her throne, and a small antique writing desk was now her command center. From here, she deftly juggled her 3 clandestine lives. Her phone was pressed to her ear, her voice a low, encouraging murmur. No, Leo, don't let their lawyers intimidate you. The city charter is on our side. Cite Section 4, Paragraph B. I'll email you the exact wording. She was the community organizer feeding her brother the legal ammunition he needed to fight his Goliaths. She hung up and immediately dialed another number. Hi, Rosa, it's Maya. Yes, the pastry order for the mayor's luncheon is confirmed. We'll need an extra dozen of the lemon tarts. He's apparently obsessed with them. She was the baker, her voice warm and efficient, her business thriving under the radar. Then she hung up, took a sip of her coffee, and turned to her laptop. Her expression shifted, becoming focused, analytical, and sharp. She opened a secure, encrypted file. On the screen was the back end of the Urban Fork's website. She was scrolling through photos she'd taken with a micro camera disguised as a lapel pin close-ups of exquisitely plated but bland-tasting food. She began to type, her fingers flying across the keyboard, crafting her next review for a pretentious new sushi bar. The fish, so fresh it must have been swimming just moments before being subjected to a fate worse than death terminal boredom. She wrote, a small, mischievous smile playing on her lips. She had built this secret identity over years, a quiet rebellion against a world of culinary snobbery. It was her voice, unfiltered and anonymous. But now, living in the enemy's camp, her access to the city's most elite, overhyped restaurants was unprecedented. The Urban Fork had never been more powerful. She was so absorbed in her writing, she didn't hear the silent hum of the elevator arriving at the private penthouse floor. She was in the middle of uploading photos when the door to the living area slid open. Ethan was home, hours earlier than expected. Her heart leaped into her throat. On her bright, high-definition laptop screen, visible from across the room, was the unmistakable layout of the Urban Fork's blog dashboard. With a gasp, she slammed the laptop shut. The sharp clack of plastic hitting plastic echoed in the sudden tense silence of the room. Ethan stopped, his briefcase in hand, and tilted his head. He had seen the sudden panicked movement. He saw the flush on her cheeks, the way her hand hovered protectively over the closed computer. Everything all right? He asked, his voice casual, but his eyes were sharp, analytical. He was a predator sensing a weakness. Fine, she chirped, her voice a little too high. Just working, a new recipe. It's a secret. She gave him a wide, forced smile. He didn't believe her. Not for a second. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes and misinterpreted it completely. He assumed she was hiding something personal, something to do with another man, perhaps a remnant of her old life. The thought sparked an unfamiliar and unwelcome jolt of possessiveness in his chest. He dismissed it as a side effect of the bet. Right, he said, his tone cool as he walked past her toward his office. Well, keep your secrets. Maya watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. She let out a breath. She didn't realize she'd been holding her hand trembling as she rested it on the warm surface of the laptop. That had been too close. Far too close. Later that evening, as Ethan sat in his silent office, his phone chimed with a single encrypted notification from Davis. He opened it. It was a memo, brief and to the point. R.E. the Urban Fork. Sir, we've begun scrubbing metadata. It's heavily masked, an expert job, but we found a recurring digital ghost, A pattern of activity uploads post-scheduling server pings consistently originates from the high-security closed-loop IP network servicing your penthouse building. Ethan read the words once, then twice. A cold electric chill traced its way down his spine. He thought of the empty chair across from him. He thought of her sudden panicked movement that afternoon. He thought of her constant typing her secret recipes. No, he thought immediately. It was absurd, impossible. The building had other residents, other networks. It was a coincidence, a ghost. He dismissed it. He had to. Because the alternative, the idea that the warm, unassuming baker in his kitchen and the sharp, anonymous critic costing him millions were one and the same person, living under his own roof, was a variable so wild, so completely outside the realm of his calculations that his mind refused to accept it. It couldn't be, could it? The invitation came via a phone call, a medium so archaic and personal that Ethan immediately knew it was from Caleb. Vance. Caleb's voice oozed a false syrupy warmth through the speaker. I'm heading up to a little place in Napa for the weekend. A private villa at Auberge. You and your lovely bride should join me. A little respite from the city. A chance for us to properly celebrate your newfound happiness. Ethan stood by the window of his penthouse, staring down at the fog rolling in over the bay. Every word was a taunt, every pause a challenge. It was a summons, a command performance. He had to go. To refuse would be to admit weakness, to concede that the performance was too difficult to maintain. We'll be there, Ethan said, his voice a flat, cold line of acceptance. When he told Maya she was standing in the kitchen carefully piping cream cheese frosting onto a batch of red velvet cupcakes. She didn't look up. Napa, she said, her hand perfectly steady. How charming. The word was delivered with the same dry irony she might use to describe a burnt cookie. She knew exactly what this was. Another stage, another act. I assume I'll need to pack my gushing bride outfits. Pack whatever you want. Ethan snapped, a raw nerve of irritation touched by Caleb's call. He turned to leave, then paused. Just make it look convincing. The villa at Auberge du Soleil was breathtaking, a secluded paradise of sandstone patios, olive trees, and infinity pools that bled into the rolling vine-covered hills of Napa Valley. It was the perfect, beautiful cage. Caleb greeted them at the door, his eyes like a hawk's, missing nothing. He scanned their body language, the carefully calculated distance between them, the polite, hollow smiles. So glad you could make it, he said, pulling Maya into a brief European-style two-cheek kiss that made Ethan's jaw tighten. You look radiant, my dear. Domestic life certainly agrees with you. The first day was an exhausting performance. Ethan would place a proprietary hand on the small of Maya's back, a gesture that felt both rehearsed and electric. She would laugh at his dry, unfunny jokes, a sound that was bright and musical to Caleb, but to Ethan's ears sounded brittle as glass. During a private wine tasting, their bickering became a low, dangerous hum beneath the sommelier's enthusiastic descriptions. And you'll notice the notes of blackberry-worn leather and just a hint of graphite, the sommelier proclaimed, swirling a deep Cabernet in a glass. It tastes like $500 of disappointment, Maya whispered to Ethan, a ghost of a smile on her lips. For God's sake, just nod and say it's robust, he hissed back, forcing a smile for Caleb, who was watching them from across the terrace. Can you at least try to look impressed? Oh, I'm impressed, she murmured, taking a delicate sip. I'm impressed that people will pay this much for fermented grape juice when a good cup of coffee brings 10 times the joy for a fraction of the price. Despite himself, a small, genuine smile tugged at the corner of Ethan's mouth before he could suppress it. The breaking point came the next afternoon during a walking tour of a prestigious family-owned vineyard. Caleb had arranged it, of course, another test. The sun was warm, the air thick with the smell of earth and ripening grapes. Maya, at Ethan's insistence, was wearing a pair of stylish but impractical wedge sandals. As they walked down a steep, gravel-strewn path between the rows of vines, her ankle turned awkwardly on a loose stone. She let out a sharp, involuntary cry of pain and stumbled, crumpling to the ground. Ethan's reaction was instantaneous, his voice sharper than he intended. Caleb and the tour guide rushed over, but Ethan was there first, kneeling beside her. Her face was pale tight with pain. I'm fine, she insisted through gritted teeth, trying to stand, but a fresh wave of pain made her sink back down. Ethan's first thought was tactical. This is a complication. His second thought, seeing the genuine tears welling in her eyes, was something else entirely. It was a raw protective instinct that bypassed his brain entirely. Don't move, he commanded, his voice now soft but firm. He gently probed her ankle. It was already starting to swell. He looked up the long, steep path back to the main villa. Without a word, he slid one arm under her knees and the other around her back, lifting her into his arms. She made a small sound of protest, her hands flying to his shoulders. "Ethan, you don't have to be quiet," he said, not unkindly. He started the long walk back, leaving a stunned Caleb in his wake. He carried her effortlessly, but he was aware of her in a way he never had been before. The solid, real weight of her in his arms. The faint, clean scent of verbena from her hair. The warmth of her breath against his neck. She was no longer a concept, a variable in a bet. She was a woman in his arms in pain, and he was taking care of her. Back in the cool, silent suite, he gently placed her on the plush sofa. He dispatched the hotel concierge for ice and a first aid kit with the efficiency of a field marshal. As he knelt before her, carefully wrapping her ankle in a compression bandage, the armor they both wore finally began to crack. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She stared at his hands, at the surprising gentleness in his touch. "It was my fault," he said, his voice low, not looking at her. "Those ridiculous shoes," I insisted. A tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "It's not the shoes," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she could no longer hold back. Sometimes I get so scared, Ethan, that I'm going to lose it all. The bakery, my home, everything my family built. I feel like I'm standing on a cliff and the ground is just crumbling away beneath my feet." He finished wrapping the bandage, his movements slow and deliberate. He finally looked up, his gray eyes holding hers, and the ruthless CEO was gone. In his place was just a man. "My father," he began, his voice raspy as if the words were being pulled from a place long since buried. "He doesn't measure success. He measures perfection. Anything less is a personal failing. My entire life, I've been running from the feeling of not being enough for him. I built an empire trying to fill a hole that just gets bigger." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and shockingly honest. They stared at each other, two adversaries who had accidentally shown each other their deepest wounds. The dynamic shifted. Later that day, as they sat on the patio, her bandaged foot propped up on a stool, he found himself listening, truly listening, as she told him stories about growing up in the bakery. When she made a dry, sarcastic comment about a particularly pretentious neighbor, he threw his head back and laughed, a real, uncalculated, booming laugh that surprised them both. He was seeing her wit, her fire, her fierce loyalty, and he realized with a dawning sense of alarm that he was starting to genuinely like the woman he was supposed to be deceiving. That night, a fire crackled in the hearth of their suite. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, charged intimacy. The wine, the shared secrets, the soft light. It had all conspired to dismantle their defenses. They were sitting on the sofa, a respectable distance between them, talking about nothing and everything. "You're not what I expected," he said softly, turning to look at her. "Neither are you," she admitted, her voice a whisper. He watched the firelight dance in her eyes, illuminating the warmth and intelligence he was only now beginning to appreciate. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he reached out and touched her face, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her cheek. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken questions. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips, his intention clear. This wasn't for Caleb. This wasn't part of the bet. This was real. A wave of panic, cold and sharp, seized her. "This is a deal. He is the enemy. He is trying to destroy your home." Her heart hammered against her ribs. If she kissed him, if she let herself feel this, she would lose. Everything she was fighting for would be compromised. Just as his lips were about to touch hers, she flinched and pulled back, turning her head away. The moment shattered. I can't," she whispered to the fire, unable to look at him. Ethan froze, his hand dropping from her face as if it had been burned. A wall of glass slammed down between them, colder and more impenetrable than ever before. He was left with a confusing, frustrating cocktail of rejection and a deep, unsettling desire. He had been genuine for the first time, and she had shut him down completely, and he had no idea why. The return from Napa was a descent into a cold, silent truce. The fragile intimacy they had shared, born from whispered confessions and shared vulnerability, had shattered the moment she'd pulled away. Now the space between them in the penthouse was a chasm of unspoken questions and simmering resentment. Ethan retreated behind a wall of icy professionalism. Maya, in turn, wrapped herself in a cloak of cheerful, busy detachment. They were orbiting each other like two planets thrown out of alignment, close enough to feel the gravitational pull, but destined never to connect. So when Maya told him she was going to be gone for the evening, her explanation felt both practiced and thin. "My Aunt Carol, she's not feeling well," she said, her eyes focused on arranging a bouquet of flowers on the kitchen island. "I'm just going to drive down the coast to see her. I'll probably be back late." Ethan looked at her, his mind replaying the moment she'd flinched from his touch. A sick aunt. It sounded plausible. It also sounded like a perfect excuse. A cold knot of suspicion tightened in his gut. "I see," he said, his voice clipped. "Well, give her my best." He had his own plans. A notification had popped up on his calendar an hour earlier. North Shore Community Alliance Emergency Town Hall. His PR team had flagged it as a low-level threat, but Ethan saw an opportunity. He would go unannounced. He would sit in the back, assess the strength of his opposition, and show the world that Ethan Vance was not a monster hiding in a tower, but a reasonable man willing to listen. It was a calculated, strategic move, and it was a welcome distraction from the infuriatingly complex woman living in his home. The community hall smelled of stale coffee, righteous indignation, and a surprising amount of hope. It was a world away from Ethan's sterile galas. The room was packed a vibrant, chaotic mix of aging hippies, young families, and third-generation shop owners. Their faces were etched with worry, but also with a fierce, stubborn defiance. They were not victims. They were fighters. Ethan found a spot in the back, his tailored suit, an island of dark wool in a sea of flannel and denim. He felt the weight of a dozen hostile stares and ignored them. The meeting began. Maya's brother Leo took the stage, his voice ringing with passion as he rallied the crowd, detailing Vance Development's latest predatory tactics. Ethan listened with a detached, analytical coldness, mentally cataloging his enemy's arguments, already formulating his counterattacks. And now Leo's voice boomed, his face flushed with emotion. "I want to bring up someone who has been the strategic mind, the tireless heart, and the unwavering soul of this fight from the very beginning. Please welcome Maya Coleman." Ethan froze. The name hit him like a physical blow. He watched a wave of vertigo washing over him as the woman he had left in his penthouse just hours ago, the woman who was supposedly at the bedside of her sick aunt, walked onto the stage to a thunderous standing ovation. The woman who took the podium was not the person he knew. This was not Maya the baker with her soft smiles and flour-dusted hands. This was not the awkward, reluctant socialite from the museum benefit. This was a commander. She stood with a posture of absolute confidence, her presence filling the room. When she spoke, her voice was not soft. It was a clear, powerful instrument of persuasion resonating with an authority he had never heard before. They call it development. She began, her gaze sweeping across the rapt faces of her neighbors. But what does that word truly mean? Does it mean erasing a neighborhood story? Does it mean replacing a family's legacy with a glass tower that blocks out the sun? She proceeded to deliver a brilliant, devastatingly effective speech. She didn't just appeal to emotion. She used facts. She presented meticulously researched data on the economic impact of displacing small businesses. She quoted zoning laws and city charters with the fluency of a seasoned lawyer, and she dismantled his company's glossy proposals with surgical precision. She was painting a picture of him, of Vance Development, as a soulless predator, and the crowd was hanging on her every word. They didn't just support her, they adored her. Ethan stood there rooted to the spot, feeling the air in his lungs solidify. The world had tilted. He was watching a stranger, a brilliant, powerful, formidable stranger who was leading an army against him. And at the very peak of her speech, as her voice rose with fiery conviction, "We will not let them turn our home into a commodity." His phone vibrated silently in his pocket. He pulled it out, his hands numb, his eyes still locked on the warrior on the stage. It was a single encrypted message from his head of security, Davis, the culmination of a week of relentless digital forensics. It contained only 5 words. Identity confirmed. The urban fork is Maya Coleman. The phone almost slipped from his grasp. The 2 revelations slammed into him at the exact same moment, a 1-2 punch that knocked the world from under his feet. The urban fork. The anonymous, razor-sharp critic who had just cost his restaurant millions. The resistance leader. The charismatic strategist who was methodically destroying his most important development project. The baker. The warm, unassuming woman who had stress-baked in his kitchen and confided her deepest fears in him. They were all the same person. A toxic, dizzying cocktail of emotions surged through him, so potent it almost made him sick. Betrayal, so profound it was breathtaking. She had been playing him from the very first moment. Fury, a white-hot rage at being so completely, so thoroughly outmaneuvered. Humiliation, a burning acid shame at his own arrogance. He, Ethan Vance, the master of the game, had been a pawn from the start. And beneath it all, terrifyingly, was a surge of raw, unadulterated admiration. It was a masterstroke, a plan so audacious, so complex, so brilliantly executed. He couldn't help but respect it, even as it was aimed directly at his heart. He felt like a fool. He didn't know how he drove back to the penthouse. When Maya arrived hours later, humming softly, she found him waiting in the main living area. The room was dark save for a single lamp that cast long, ominous shadows. He was sitting in her emerald green armchair, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. She stopped short, the cheerful hum dying in her throat. The air was thick, heavy with a silence that felt dangerous. "Ethan," she said, her voice uncertain, "you're still up. How was your evening?" He didn't move. He just watched her, his gray eyes as cold and dark as a winter storm. He let the silence stretch, letting her feel the weight of it, the wrongness of it. Finally, he spoke, his voice dangerously quiet, each word a carefully placed stone. "I went to a town hall tonight," he said, "down in the North Shore. I saw a brilliant community leader, absolutely captivating." Maya's blood ran cold. He continued, his voice dropping even lower. "And then, I got a report about a food critic, a very influential one." He slowly stood up, walking out of the shadows and toward her. He stopped just a few feet away, his face a mask of cold fury. "It seems..." He paused, letting the final words land with the force of an executioner's blade. "They are both my wife." He took one more step, his eyes boring into hers, searching for the truth in a sea of lies. "Tell me, Maya," he whispered, the sound a raw, broken thing. "Who, exactly, did I marry?" Maya felt the floor beneath her feet dissolve. His voice, a low, venomous whisper, stripped away every defense she had so carefully constructed. The blood pounded in her ears, a frantic, panicked drumbeat. For a split second, she saw her entire intricately woven plan unraveling into dust. She had prepared for this possibility, of course. She had run the simulations in her mind 100 times. But the reality of it, the cold, burning fury in his eyes as he stood before her, was a force she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just business. This was personal. She lifted her chin, a reflexive act of defiance. Her heart was a trapped bird beating against her ribs, but her voice when it came out was shockingly steady. "You married a baker." "Ethan," she said, her tone as cool and brittle as spun sugar. "The rest is just research." The lie was audacious, a final, desperate gambit, but he didn't buy it. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped his lips. "Research," he repeated, the word dripping with contempt. "You have waged a multi-front war against my businesses, from inside my home, from my table. You've used my life as your tactical advantage." He took a step closer, the scent of his rage a palpable thing in the air. "That's not research, Maya. That's espionage." The pretense was not just shattered, it was annihilated. The penthouse, once a stage for their fake relationship, transformed overnight into a silent, icy war zone. The vast, empty spaces now felt like no man's land. The polite morning greetings were replaced by a crushing silence. They moved around each other with the wary, calculated grace of two exposed adversaries, each waiting for the other to make a move. The air was thick with unspoken threats, with the terrible weight of what he now knew. Ethan spent the next 2 days wrestling with a dilemma that was tearing him apart. He held all the cards. The power he possessed was absolute, and it was a simple matter to destroy her. His fingers hovered over his phone, a single call away from leaking an anonymous tip to the press. The Urban Fork, the city's champion of culinary integrity, is the wife of billionaire Ethan Vance, whose restaurant she just conveniently destroyed. Her credibility as a critic would be eviscerated. Her voice, her secret weapon, would be silenced forever. He drafted an email to his legal team. The marriage contract was entered into under fraudulent pretenses. The subject was actively engaged in sabotage against my corporate interests at the time of signing. We have grounds to break the moratorium. Her neighborhood, her precious home, would be at the mercy of his bulldozers by the end of the month. He had the weapons. They were loaded. But he couldn't pull the trigger. Every time he resolved to do it, the cold logic of revenge would be ambushed by something else. An image of her laughing at his stupid joke in Napa, The memory of her quiet confession about her family's legacy, the searing, undeniable admiration he felt watching her command that stage, ruining her, it felt wrong. It was an illogical, inefficient, and deeply infuriating emotion. And worse, there was the bet. To expose her would be to hand Caleb the victory on a silver platter, a public admission that Ethan Vance had been played for a fool. His pride, his damn stubborn pride, was acting as her shield. He was trapped, paralyzed by a war between his ruthless instincts and a nascent conscience he didn't even know he had. Maya felt his paralysis, and she knew it wouldn't last. He was a predator momentarily confused, but he would eventually attack. She couldn't afford to wait. Her best defense now was a bold offense. Knowing he could ruin her at any moment, she walked into her corner office, sat down at her laptop, and doubled down. She channeled all her fear, her anger, and her fierce love for her community into her keyboard. She wrote the most powerful piece of her life. It wasn't a review of a restaurant. It was a manifesto. The post, titled "The Soul of a City is Not for Sale," went live on the Urban Fork blog at dawn. It was an ode to legacy businesses, to the bakeries and flower shops and bookstores that served as the heart of a neighborhood. It was a searing indictment of corporate greed of the vulture developers who saw history as a line item to be erased. She didn't name Vance Development. She didn't have to. The piece was a work of art full of passion, nostalgia, and razor-sharp economic arguments. By noon, it had gone viral. It was shared by city supervisors, local celebrities, and national news outlets. The fight for the North Shore was no longer a local skirmish. It was a national story, a symbol of a larger struggle. Maya had taken her quiet war and made it deafeningly loud. She had turned public opinion into her shield. Ethan saw the article. He read every single brilliant, infuriating word. It was aimed directly at him, a declaration of war disguised as a love letter to a community. And he knew with a sickening certainty that she had just made it 10 times harder for him to move against her. She was a master strategist. The phone call from Caleb came that afternoon. "Vance, my friend." Caleb's voice was laced with a feigned sympathy that was more insulting than open mockery. "I'm hearing things. Trouble in paradise. You two look tense. You should come out tonight. A few friends are getting together for a little poker at my club. A friendly game. You two can relax. Unwind." It was not a request. It was a summons to the Coliseum. Caleb had smelled blood in the water and wanted a front row seat for the kill. "We'll be there," Ethan said through gritted teeth. The atmosphere at the private club was suffocating, all dark wood cigar smoke and the quiet clinking of ice and expensive whiskey. The tension between Ethan and Maya was a spectacle. They walked in together, a chasm of frozen silence between them, their faces perfect, polite masks that fooled no one, especially not Caleb. They sat at the circular poker table, the green felt between them, the new battlefield. The chips were just colored clay, but they might as well have been pieces of their lives. For 2 hours they played. Maya was surprisingly good, her face an unreadable, serene mask, her bets calm and deliberate. Ethan played with a cold, aggressive precision, trying to force his will onto the cards, onto the table, onto her. During a lull in the game, as the dealer was shuffling, Caleb leaned over to Ethan, his voice a low, venomous whisper meant only for him. He gestured with his chin toward Maya, who was calmly studying her cards, her expression giving away nothing. "Careful, Vance," Caleb murmured, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Looks like you're not the only one in your marriage who knows how to bluff." Caleb's whispered words hung in the air between them, a cloud of poison. "Looks like you're not the only one in your marriage who knows how to bluff." Ethan didn't react. His face remained a mask of stone, but inside 1,000 alarms were screaming. It wasn't just the taunt. It was the smugness, the absolute unwavering confidence in Caleb's eyes. It wasn't the look of a rival enjoying a good show. It was the look of a director watching his masterpiece unfold, exactly as he'd written it. The bet, the fight with the North Shore, Maya's brilliant, infuriating countermoves. Caleb was taking too much pleasure in it all. It felt orchestrated. A short while later, the game's host called for a 20-minute break. The players stood stretching their legs. Caleb clapped a man on the back, laughed at a joke, and then with a subtle glance around the room, excused himself, heading toward a secluded corridor that led to the private balconies. Suspicion, cold and sharp, coiled in Ethan's gut. He gave a curt nod to Maya, a silent command to stay put, and then moving with a fluid, predatory quietness, he followed. He found a recessed alcove deep in shadow just yards from the balcony, where Caleb stood silhouetted against the glittering city lights. His rival was on the phone, his voice a low, triumphant murmur carried on the night air. "No, it's playing out perfectly," Caleb said, a laugh in his voice. "Vance is so blinded by his own ego, he's practically bankrolling the resistance against himself. The moratorium was an unexpected gift. Gives us a full year to let them bleed each other out." Ethan's blood ran cold. "His wife is a firecracker," Caleb continued, chuckling. "Her little blog posts are fanning the flames beautifully. The more she drives down public opinion of Vance development, the more the property values stagnate." There was a pause. "Exactly. When the time is right, when both sides are exhausted and financially drained, Viridian Holdings will sweep in. They'll be so desperate they'll sell for pennies on the dollar. We won't just get the North Shore project, we'll get it for nothing." Viridian Holdings. The name slammed into Ethan's mind like a freight train, a ghost entity, a shell corporation he'd seen pop up in other hostile takeovers, its funding sources always untraceable. He leaned against the cold wall, the entire horrifying architecture of the scheme crashing down on him. Caleb hadn't just made a bet. He had engineered a war. He had used Ethan's pride, Maya's desperation, and the fate of an entire community as pawns in a much larger, more brutal game. He had played them both. He had played everyone. The staggering, monumental scale of the deception took Ethan's breath away. He felt a rage so pure, so absolute, it eclipsed everything else. It burned away his anger at Maya, his humiliation over the bet. This was a different beast entirely. He moved from the shadows, his mind a whirlwind of cold, strategic fury. He walked back into the card room, his eyes scanning the crowd, until he found her. She was standing by the bar, nursing a club soda, looking isolated and defiant. He walked straight to her, his movements urgent. He grabbed her by the elbow, his grip firm. "We're leaving," he said, his voice a low, tight command. She looked up at him, startled by the raw intensity in his eyes. "What, the game isn't over?" The game was over before it started. He cut her off, his voice barely a whisper. "Caleb played us, both of us, from the very beginning." He saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes. "Get your coat, now. I'll explain in the car." The ride back to the penthouse was not silent. The hostility that had filled the car on the way there had evaporated, replaced by a frenetic, crackling energy. As the city lights blurred past the windows, Ethan laid out everything he had overheard: Caleb's plan, the shell corporation, the strategy to let them destroy each other. Maya listened, her poker face finally crumbling, replaced by a mask of dawning, horrified understanding. The color drained from her cheeks. "Viridian Holdings." She whispered the name, tasting like ash in her mouth. "They sent the initial buyout letters, before Vance Development even got involved. We thought they were just another small-time predator." "They're not small-time," Ethan said, his hands clenching the steering wheel. "They're Caleb's demolition crew." He set the fire. "Maya," then he made a bet with me on who could put it out first, knowing we'd both just end up fanning the flames. For the first time since the night of the unveiling, they looked at each other not as adversaries, but as co-conspirators. Two brilliant opposing generals who had just discovered they were fighting on the wrong sides of a war orchestrated by a third hidden enemy. "His goal is to devalue the entire district," she said, her mind racing, connecting the dots. "By pinning the community against you, he creates chaos, uncertainty. Investors pull back, property values plummet, and he buys our battlefield for scrap." Ethan finished, a grim admiration in his voice. "It's brilliant. It's ruthless. It's something I would have done." The admission hung in the air, a stark, ugly truth. As they pulled into the penthouse's private garage, a new unspoken truce had been forged between them. The hostility was gone, but the tension remained repurposed. It was no longer a weapon aimed at each other. It was now a shared energy focused outward on a common target. They rode the elevator up in a charged silence, their minds whirring. When the doors slid open to the penthouse, they didn't break apart and retreat to their separate corners as they had for weeks. They moved as one. They strode past the living room, past the kitchen, and went straight into his home office, the sleek, glass-walled nerve center of his empire. Without a word, Ethan unrolled a set of architectural blueprints for the North Shore district across his massive desk. Maya immediately leaned over them, her finger tracing the streets she knew by heart. He pulled up financial reports on his multi-screen display, bringing up everything he had on Viridian Holdings and Caleb's known investors. He looked at her, at the fierce intelligence burning in her eyes as she absorbed the data on the maps. He saw his own strategic fire reflected back at him. You know the community, Ethan said, his voice quiet but filled with a new, resonant intensity. You know the people, their fears, what motivates them. You know how to win their hearts. He paused, then tapped a financial statement on the screen with his finger. I know corporate warfare. I know how to find a company's weakness and how to cripple it financially. He looked up from the blueprints, his gray eyes locking with hers across the desk. The air between them crackled, not with romance, not with anger, but with the thrilling, potent intimacy of two brilliant minds aligning for battle. Let's go ruin him, Ethan said. The penthouse office, once the cold heart of Ethan's solitary empire, transformed into a bustling war room. The silence was replaced by the low hum of computer monitors, the scratch of markers on a whiteboard, and the rapid-fire exchange of two brilliant minds finally aimed at the same target. Takeout containers littered the mahogany desk next to billion-dollar financial projections. It was organized chaos. It was the most alive the space had ever felt. Their attack was two-pronged, a pincer movement designed to cripple Caleb from the outside in and the inside out. Ethan went after the money. He gathered his most ruthless traitors, the ones he usually unleashed on hostile takeovers in a secure video conference. Our target, Ethan said, his voice a blade of ice, is Omnicorp, Caleb Reed's parent company. He brought up a series of charts on the screen. It's over-leveraged, propped up by a handful of institutional investors who spook easily. We are going to initiate a strategic short position. I want you to flood the market, create a narrative of instability. I want every investor they have to feel the icy grip of panic. He paused, a cold smile touching his lips. Let's remind Mr. Reed what happens when you play in my sandbox. While Ethan sharpened his financial knives, Maya unsheathed her own weapon words. She sat in her emerald green armchair, a laptop glowing in the dim light, her fingers flying across the keys. She wasn't writing a review. She was writing a call to arms. The piece, published on the Urban Fork blog under the bold title "The Soul of a City is Not for Sale," was a masterclass in public persuasion. She never once mentioned Caleb Reed or Viridian Holdings by name. She didn't have to. There is a new breed of predator stalking our city's streets, she wrote. They don't have fangs or claws. They have shell corporations and glossy brochures. They speak of urban renewal when they mean cultural erasure. They see our history not as a foundation to be cherished, but as a footprint to be paved over. They dangle the promise of progress, but they are selling a sanitized, soulless future built on the ghosts of family-owned businesses and the rubble of our shared memories. She didn't just attack. She proposed a solution. She laid out a detailed, intelligent vision for a city-backed historic commerce zone in the North Shore, a plan that would protect legacy businesses while encouraging ethical, community-focused growth. The effect was immediate and seismic. Ethan's traders executed his plan with brutal efficiency. Omnicorp's stock began to hemorrhage value. Financial news networks lit up with panicked speculation. Caleb was suddenly fighting a 5-alarm fire in his own house, his phone ringing off the hook with furious investors. Simultaneously, Maya's article exploded across the media landscape. It was no longer a local blog post. It was a national talking point. It was read aloud on morning news shows, debated on political talk radio, and shared by hundreds of thousands of people who saw their own communities reflected in her passionate defense. The North Shore was no longer just a neighborhood. It was a symbol. Through it all, Ethan and Maya worked in a seamless, electrifying synchronicity. The lines that had once defined them, captor and captive, manipulator and victim, had blurred into nothing. They were partners. He would be on a call dismantling Caleb's supply chain, and she would slide a cup of coffee onto his desk, murmuring, "The transportation union just pledged their support. Use that." She would be struggling to decipher a complex zoning document, and he would lean over her shoulder, his presence a warm, solid thing, and point to a single line. There, he'd say, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "That's his legal loophole. We need to close it." He found himself utterly captivated by her brilliance, by the way she could weave words into a shield and a sword. She, in turn, was drawn to the focused, lethal intensity she had once feared, now repurposed for a cause she believed in. This powerful, dangerous man was fighting for her home. The devastating blow landed on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. An alert flashed on Ethan's screen. It was a press release from the San Francisco City Council. He read it aloud, his voice quiet with disbelief. Swayed by overwhelming public support and the proposal championed by the Urban Fork, The council has officially passed a motion to endorse the creation of the North Shore Historic Commerce Zone. He took a breath. Furthermore, they are launching a formal investigation into the predatory acquisition tactics of Viridian Holdings and its potential affiliates. They had won. They stared at each other across the office, the quiet hum of the computers the only sound. A slow smile spread across Maya's face, a radiant, genuine smile that lit up the entire room. Ethan felt his own lips mirror the expression. They had won, together. That night, to celebrate, he opened a bottle of wine, not a $500 bottle meant to impress, but a simple, robust Zinfandel he knew she liked. They stood in the kitchen, the battle over the silence between them, no longer tense, but humming with a new electric energy. To the urban fork, he said, raising his glass, the most formidable critic in the city. And to the shark, she replied, her eyes sparkling as she clinked her glass against his, who finally decided to eat another shark. They laughed, the sound warm and easy in the quiet room. The adrenaline of their shared victory faded, leaving something else in its place, something softer, more dangerous. The air grew thick. He could smell the faint scent of cinnamon that always seemed to cling to her, mixed with the rich aroma of the wine. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as a pawn, not as a critic, not as an ally, but as Maya. The woman who had infuriated him, challenged him, and ultimately captivated him. He reached out his hand, hesitating for a split second before his fingers gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Her breath hitched. He let his hand linger, his thumb stroking her cheek, his gaze dropping to her lips. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, every chance to shatter the moment like she had in Napa. But this time, she didn't. She held his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs, a mix of terror and longing in her eyes. And as his lips met hers, it wasn't a victory or a defeat. It wasn't part of a bet or a contract. It was a quiet, breathtaking surrender. The kiss was a quiet cataclysm. It was the demolition of walls that had stood between them for months, leaving them in a strange new landscape of breathtaking vulnerability. When they finally broke apart, the air in the kitchen was thick with unspoken words, with the ghost of a war they had won together, and the dawn of a fragile, terrifying peace. Ethan looked at her truly, seeing her without the filter of his own arrogance or the shadow of the bet. He saw the strength that had challenged him, the wit that had disarmed him, and the warmth that was now impossibly melting the ice around his own heart. He opened his mouth to say something, what he didn't know, but the private elevator chimed its arrival, a sound so unexpected it made them both flinch. The doors slid open. A man stepped out, tall and severe, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite and disapproval. He wore a perfectly tailored suit that was even more expensive than Ethan's, and he carried with him an aura of cold, old money power that instantly chilled the warmth in the room. Ethan's posture changed in a heartbeat. His shoulders straightened, his face hardening into the familiar, impenetrable mask. "Father," he said, his voice flat, stripped of all emotion. Arthur Vance's gaze swept the room, taking in the wine bottle, the two glasses, the comfortable intimacy. His eyes, a paler, colder version of Ethan's, landed on Maya. He didn't so much look at her as assess her, his gaze lingering for a moment on her curves, her simple clothing, his expression one of profound, undisguised disdain. "So," Arthur Vance said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that dripped with condescension, "this is the woman who has made my son the laughingstock of this city." Maya felt a chill crawl up her spine. This was the source of Ethan's demons. The architect of the man he was, or the man he had been. "I heard about your little fiasco in the North Shore." Arthur continued, his eyes still fixed on Maya, as if she were a distasteful piece of furniture. "Halting a billion-dollar development project, publicly capitulating to a mob of shopkeepers. And for what?" He finally turned his cold gaze on his son. "For her? Have you lost your mind, Ethan? Have you grown weak?" The word hung in the air, weak, the ultimate sin in the Vance family creed. Ethan's jaw tightened. The project was no longer viable, he said, his voice clipped and defensive. It was a strategic pivot. Arthur let out a short, brutal laugh. "A strategic pivot," he mocked. "I taught you to break your enemies, not to subsidize them. I taught you to build an empire, not to let it be dismantled by some baker." He waved a dismissive hand in Maya's direction. "You used to have standards. At least your other women were decorative. This one, This one has apparently made you sentimental, and sentiment is the death of business. Every word was a calculated blow designed to strike at Ethan's deepest insecurities. Maya saw him flinch, saw the old familiar armor slide into place. But then Arthur made a mistake. He turned his full venomous attention back to her. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing," Miss Arthur sneered, "but it ends now. You will find that the Vance fortune does not look kindly on parasites." And that was it. The trigger. Something inside Ethan finally snapped. "That's enough," he said. His voice was quiet, but it vibrated with a raw, dangerous intensity that made even his father pause. Ethan stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Maya, a human shield. He looked at his father, and for the first time in his life, there was no fear in his eyes, only a cold, clear, liberating fury. "You will not speak to her that way," Ethan said, his voice low and shaking with rage. "You stand there, in your world of cold transactions and brutal acquisitions, and you dare to judge her." He laughed, a real bitter sound. "This woman has more integrity in her little finger than you have in your entire body. She has more strength, more passion, and more loyalty than anyone I have ever met. She fights for what she believes in. She builds things, real things, things with a soul." He took a deep breath, the words pouring out of him, a dam breaking after a lifetime of holding back. "You talk about weakness. My entire life I have been chasing your definition of strength, and it has made me empty. This North Shore fiasco is the first thing I've done in years that I am actually proud of." He looked from his stunned father to Maya, his eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering conviction. "And just so we're clear," he said, his voice ringing through the silent penthouse, "Vance Development is officially permanently pulling out of the North Shore project." He held his father's shocked gaze. "Furthermore, I will be the first private investor in the new historic commerce zone. I am done building your empire, father. I'm going to build something that matters." Arthur Vance stared at his son, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He saw not a weak, sentimental boy, but a stranger, a man he no longer controlled. Without another word, he turned on his heel, strode to the elevator, and was gone. The silence he left behind was profound. Ethan stood there, his chest heaving, his body trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation. He was emotionally raw, completely exposed. He slowly turned to face Maya, his eyes filled with a terrifying vulnerability. "I meant it," he whispered, his voice hoarse, shaking slightly. "All of it." He took her hands in his grip desperate as if he were holding on for dear life. "The bet," he said, the words torn from him. "The bet is the dumbest, most arrogant thing I have ever done in my life. A life that has been full of them." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "It stopped being about the bet a long time ago, Maya. For me, at least. Now, all I care about is you." He swallowed hard. "I love you, Maya. I am in love with you." The confession hung between them, simple, powerful, and utterly terrifying. Maya's heart ached with the force of her own emotions. She saw the truth of his words in the raw pain and hope etched on his face. She loved him too. An impossible, illogical, undeniable love. But as she looked at this new, vulnerable man before her, a cold, practical reality settled in her gut. The reality of their foundation. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. She squeezed his hands. She stopped, taking a shaky breath. "The year is almost over." He looked at her, his expression confused, hopeful. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with love and a heartbreaking question. "The bet will end," she said softly. "The contract will expire." She paused, the weight of their entire history hanging on her next words. "What happens to us then?" The final weeks of the contract were a strange, beautiful paradox. The question Maya had asked, "What happens to us then?" hung between them, a ghost at their feast of newfound love. They lived in a bubble of fragile intimacy, learning the rhythm of each other's hearts, but always with the quiet, relentless ticking of a clock in the background. The contract, the very document that had been their battlefield, was now the only thing holding their world together. Without it, what were they? The end came, as they knew it would, in the form of an email. It arrived on the 365th day, an emergency summons to the Ether corporate boardroom, called by Caleb Reed. "This is it," Maya said softly, reading the notification over Ethan's shoulder in their office. Her hand rested on his back, a simple gesture of support that felt more real than any public performance they had ever staged. His last move, Ethan agreed, his face grim, a desperate one. He's going to try to burn it all down. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers. "You don't have to come. This is my mess." "Your mess," she replied, a faint sad smile on her lips. "Ethan, it stopped being just your mess a long time ago. It became our mess." She squeezed his shoulder. "We see it through. Together." The Ether boardroom was on the top floor of a different glass tower, but the atmosphere was the same: cold, powerful, and utterly unforgiving. The long obsidian table was surrounded by the board members, a jury of stone-faced men and women who controlled a significant portion of the global economy. Caleb was already there, sitting opposite Ethan's empty chair, his face a mask of smug, vindictive triumph. He looked like a man about to cash a winning lottery ticket. He watched his smirk widening as the door opened, but his expression faltered when Ethan and Maya walked in. They didn't walk in like a CEO and his wife. They walked in like partners moving in sync, a united front projecting an aura of calm, unbreakable strength. They took their seats, the silence in the room so absolute you could hear the whisper of the ventilation system. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice." Caleb began, his voice ringing with false sincerity as he addressed the board. He couldn't keep the glee out of his eyes. "I've called this meeting because a matter of profound ethical breach has come to my attention, a matter that directly concerns the control and future of this entire project." He paused for dramatic effect, his gaze landing on Ethan like a vulture. "It seems our esteemed colleague, Mr. Vance, did not win his controlling stake in Ether through shrewd business tactics. He won it through a wager." A ripple of shock and confusion went through the room. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Before Caleb could continue, before he could land his killing blow, Ethan held up a hand. "He's right," Ethan said. His voice was calm, clear, and carried across the silent room. Caleb froze, his mouth slightly agape, the rest of his triumphant speech dying on his lips. Ethan slowly stood up, not as a man on trial, but as a man taking command. He looked at each board member, his gaze steady and direct. "1 year ago today," he began, his voice even factual, devoid of any self-pity, "I made a bet with Mr. Reed, a foolish, arrogant, and deeply dishonorable bet. I wagered that I could convince a woman, this woman," he gestured to Maya, his expression softening for a fraction of a second, "to marry me and to maintain the public performance of a loving marriage for 1 full year. The prize was his controlling stake in this project." The room erupted in a chorus of shocked, angry murmurs. It was a scandal of epic proportions. "I am not here to make excuses," Ethan continued, his voice cutting through the noise. "My actions were born from an arrogance I can no longer defend. I treated a person's life as a commodity and a community's fate as collateral damage. There is no apology sufficient for that." He took a deep breath. "Mr. Reed is correct. According to the terms of our bet, he is entitled to my shares. But I believe there is a debt that supersedes the one I owe to him." He looked directly at Caleb, whose face was now a mask of confusion and rage. Then Ethan did something no one in the room could have ever predicted. Therefore, he announced, his voice ringing with a new authority, the authority of a man who had finally chosen his own path. "I am forfeiting my entire stake in the Ether project, effective immediately." The room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Even Maya gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I am transferring all of my shares," Ethan declared, "into a newly formed independent charitable trust, the Ether Trust. Its mission will be to provide grants and seed funding for urban renewal projects and the preservation of small independent businesses. Its profits will be used to build, not to demolish." He paused, his gaze finding Maya's across the table. "The Trust's first official act will be to fully fund the creation and endowment of the North Shore Historic Commerce Zone." He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "And I can think of no one better to help guide its moral compass. So I will be publicly naming Maya Coleman as a founding advisor to the Trust." He had lost the bet. He had sacrificed a fortune. And in doing so, he had won the only thing that now mattered. He had honored her, and he had become the man he'd promised he would be. The aftermath was brutal and swift. Caleb sat there speechless, his grand victory having turned to ash in his mouth. He had won the battle, but Ethan had rewritten the terms of the war, leaving him with nothing but public humiliation. His reputation in a world built on perception was irrevocably destroyed. Ethan and Maya left the boardroom, leaving the chaos and the stunned silence behind them. They didn't speak as they walked to the elevator, nor as they descended the 60 floors to the ground. The immense weight of the bet, the contract, the year-long performance, it was all gone. They were free. But the freedom felt vast and terrifying and empty. Back at the penthouse, the silence was different. It wasn't the hostile silence of their Cold War, nor the charged silence of their newfound romance. It was a hollow silence, the silence of a structure that has been completely dismantled. Everything that had defined their relationship, for better or for worse, was now gone. Ethan walked to the bar and poured 2 glasses of water, his hands unsteady. He handed one to her. He looked around the beautiful, sterile room that had somehow impossibly become a home. He finally turned to her, his heart breaking with every word he was about to say. He had to give her the one thing the contract had never truly allowed, a choice. "Well," he said, his voice soft, raw, "our deal is officially concluded." He looked into her eyes, trying to pour all of his love, all of his regret into that single gaze. "You're free, Maya," he whispered the words, feeling like a wound in his own chest. "You saved your home." He had given her everything he could. He had secured her legacy, honored her name, and given her justice. And now to prove his love was real, he had to do the hardest thing of all. He had to give her the freedom to leave him. The words hung in the vast silent space between them. "You're free, Maya." It was the sentence she had fought for, bled for, and gambled her entire life on. It was the sound of victory. But as it echoed in the quiet of the penthouse, it felt exactly like the tolling of a bell at a funeral. Her own. She couldn't find her voice. She simply gave him a small, numb nod, turned and walked out of the penthouse, leaving him standing alone in the home they had accidentally built together. She didn't take a cab. She walked. For hours she walked, letting the cool San Francisco air try to clear her head. She found herself as if on autopilot, heading back to the North Shore, her home, her battlefield, her prize. But as she walked the familiar streets, something was profoundly different. The angry red for sale signs that had blighted the landscape for so long were gone. In their place were new hopeful signs, their bright blue lettering proclaiming "Future Home of the North Shore Historic Commerce Zone," funded by the Ether Trust. Mrs. Petrov was outside her flower shop, not with a look of worry, but with a wide, beaming smile as she arranged a bucket of vibrant peonies. She saw Maya and her face lit up, rushing over to hug her so tightly Maya could barely breathe. "You did it, my dear girl," Mrs. Petrov whispered, her voice thick with tears. "You saved us. You saved all of us." It was the same everywhere she went. Her brother Leo lifted her off her feet in a jubilant, laughing hug outside the bakery. The owner of the old bookstore pressed a rare first edition into her hands, his eyes shining with gratitude. The sweet hearth itself was bustling, the tables full, the air alive with the chatter of a community that felt safe for the first time in years. She had won, utterly, completely. But as she stood in the doorway of her own triumphant bakery, watching her neighbors celebrate the victory she had secured for them, an ache spread through her chest, so profound and hollow it stole her breath. This was her home. This was her legacy. And it felt empty. It felt like a beautiful, perfectly decorated room with no one in it. She closed her eyes, and the image that filled her mind wasn't of the warm brick walls of the bakery. It was of a cold glass penthouse overlooking the bay. It was the image of a ridiculously plush emerald armchair of flour dusting a marble countertop, of a man's rare booming laugh echoing in a sterile space. She realized with a clarity that was both devastating and liberating that the cold penthouse had become a home because he was in it. The fight wasn't about the bakery anymore. The fight was for him. She returned to the penthouse that evening, her heart pounding with a new terrifying purpose. She found him in the master bedroom, a space they had begun tentatively to share. A small, expensive leather duffel bag sat on the bed. He was packing. He was folding one of his perfect custom-made shirts with a slow, heartbreaking precision. He looked up when she entered, and his face was a portrait of quiet, dignified sorrow. He gave her a sad, gentle smile. "I figured," he started, his voice soft, a little rough, "I figured you'd want the place to yourself for a while. To breathe." He was doing it. He was actually leaving. He was giving her the final, ultimate gift of his love, his absence. And she knew in that moment that she would not let him. She walked toward him, shaking her head slowly, a real smile, the first one all day, finally breaking across her face. "The contract is over, Ethan," she said, her voice soft but sure. He looked at her, his expression confused. "Which means," she continued, her smile widening, We need a new one. He stared at her, uncomprehending. She reached into the pocket of the simple apron she still wore from her visit to the bakery. Her hand emerged, not with a pin, but with a small, dark blue velvet ring box. She opened it. Inside, nestled in the velvet, was a simple, elegant wedding band of brushed platinum. It was solid, understated, and strong. It was a ring for a partner, for an equal. Ethan looked from the ring to her face, his eyes wide with a dawning, disbelieving hope. "Maya," he breathed, his voice choked. "No stakes." She began, her voice trembling just slightly with the force of her emotion. No clauses, no exit strategies, no bets. She looked him directly in the eye, her entire heart in her gaze. "Will you be my husband, Ethan? For real this time?" For a moment he was utterly still, as if his mind couldn't process the reversal, the sheer, beautiful impossibility of it. Then a sound escaped him, a sound caught somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Tears filled his eyes as a smile of pure, unadulterated joy transformed his face. "Yes," he whispered the word, full of wonder. "God, yes," 1 year later. The wedding was not in a cold boardroom or a sterile penthouse. It was in the North Shore community garden, surrounded by fragrant roses and laughing friends. Maya wore a simple, elegant ivory dress, and Ethan wore a suit, but his tie was loosened and his smile was free and constant. Leo stood by his side as his best man, and Mrs. Petrov threw organic, locally sourced flower petals. It was a celebration of love that had been forged in fire, and it was perfect. The final shot is not of a skyline, but of a kitchen. The bustling, warm kitchen of the sweet hearth. Ethan, his sleeves rolled up, a white apron covered in a Jackson Pollock-esque splatter of flour, is clumsily trying to knead a massive ball of sourdough dough. He is laughing, completely inept and utterly deliriously happy. Maya comes up behind him, her own apron now straining slightly over a gentle new curve. She wraps her arms around his waist, resting her chin on his shoulder as she laughs with him. He has found his true wealth. It isn't measured in billions or in boardrooms. It is solid and warm, and it smells like fresh bread. Together in the heart of the community they saved, they have finally built their own sweetest hearth. And so, Ethan and Maya found their home not in a place but in each other. It's a beautiful ending to a turbulent story, but the real power isn't just in the happy ending. It's in the difficult, messy, and profound journey they took to get there. When I reflect on a story like this, I can't help but see the echoes of our own lives in it. We all wear masks, don't we? We present a version of ourselves to the world, the successful one, the tough one, the one who has it all together. Ethan's mask was arrogance and power. He lived in a world of glass towers and cold transactions, believing he had mastered the game of life. But his empire was built on a foundation of emptiness, a desperate attempt to win the approval of a father who only measured perfection. And Maya, her mask was the simple, unassuming baker. But underneath that quiet exterior was a brilliant strategist, a fierce community leader, and a powerful voice who could shape the opinion of a city. This story is such a powerful reminder that the people we meet are always more than the labels we assign them. The most interesting parts of a person are never what you see on the surface. They're hidden in the chapters you haven't read yet. But the lesson that truly resonates with me is about the nature of change. It's easy to say this is a story about redemption, but what does that word even mean? Ethan didn't win Maya's heart by simply saying, "I'm sorry." Words are cheap. His apology wasn't a word, it was an action. He proved his change by sacrificing his fortune, by dismantling his own father's toxic legacy, and by choosing to build something that mattered instead of something that was just big. It reminds us that true change, true redemption, isn't about what we say we'll do. It's about what we actually do when no one is forcing us to. It's about the choices we make when our backs are against the wall. It leads me to a thought that I believe sits at the very heart of their journey. The heaviest walls we have to tear down are not the ones we find in the world, but the ones we build inside our own minds. Ethan had to tear down the walls of his prejudice and pride. Maya had to tear down the walls of her justified anger and mistrust. Only then could they truly see each other. But what do you think, was Ethan's transformation believable, or was it a fairy tale? And what about Maya? Her initial deception was for a noble cause, but does the end always justify the means? Could you ever learn to love someone who started out as your sworn enemy? If this story makes you think, please share your thoughts in the comments below. If you have a different opinion, I'd genuinely love to hear it. The best stories are the ones that spark a real conversation. And if you enjoy exploring the deeper meanings behind stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss the next journey we take together.